So, Ravi is going to be, and he was instrumental in bringing our final guest to Singapore, representing the Mandela Foundation and Global Citizen. Please welcome Ravi, Krishnan, and Kweku Mandela.
Here we go. Thanks, Jess, for the sterling introduction. Thanks, everyone, for staying around. I know you're all keen to have a drink, but let us get through this, please. Great privilege to be on the stage with my friend Kweku. In preparation for today, I was thinking about what should I do to prepare for today, and I watched two movies relevant to the topic. One was 83. If you haven't seen it, you should watch it. It's about India winning the Cricket World Cup in 1983. And the other was Invictus, which is, if you haven't seen that, you've got to see that. And that's about South Africa winning the Rugby World Cup in 1995. What a lot of people don't know about the 83 World Cup victory for India was that India was going through a time of civil unrest. And I'm sure there was some poetic license in the movie, but legend has it that in one of the cabinet meetings, one of the ministers was listening to the World Cup, and Indira Gandhi was like, berating him for not paying attention and asking him what he was doing. And they were talking about India progressing at a time where India wasn't supposed to win. And she realised very quickly that a way to, deal with the unrest was to make the matches available to everyone in the country. And that's what they did. They made the matches available on the terrestrial TV, and everyone watched cricket, and the unrest settled, and India won. And that was unexpected, and it changed the face of sport in that country, and it had impact. 1995, and I mean, I got goosebumps watching Invictus, on the plane on the way over. I mean, it's extraordinary scene when your grandfather, Nelson Mandela, goes to has a visit from the captain, Francois Pienaar, and essentially, not knowing much about rugby, but seeing the power of rugby, had decided that that was a way to unify a country. He'd just got out of jail after 27 years, or he'd been out of jail for a few years and become president. After 27 years, he was in prison, 18 years on Robben Island, and he saw rugby as a way of unifying the country. Again, they went on to win, and it changed. It had immediate impact. Kweku, you're a filmmaker. You're the chief vision officer for Global Citizen. You're a Mandela. Sport and popular culture, their ability to make impact beyond commerce. You've worked across all those genres. Tell us what it means to you.
I think it's what it means to all of us, and probably the most recent event that we're all going to remember is the Paris 2024 Olympics, right? And there, for the first time, probably in a global spectacle, were more recognized memes, right, than there probably were highlights. Everything from obviously the breakdancing spectacular that we saw from Australia's great participant.
I knew you'd have to bring that up. I'm not breaking dancing, I promise you.
The opening ceremony, right, and how everyone reacted to that, and the optics of what we see on TV, obviously what you experience in real life. 1995, the Rugby World Cup in South Africa was unique for me for a number of reasons. I'd just come back to the country after living in exile in the United States, and it was clear that the country was having an identity crisis because people hadn't lived together. The idea of what it meant to be South African was not something that people really understood. There was a lot of fear around where the country was going. and this rugby spectacle comes to the country. And a number of people that were close to my grandfather and that were heavily involved in the government did not feel that rugby was something that should be celebrated. It had been weaponized under the previous government, and him and a few people took the decision that ultimately this was a place that we could create a new national sense of pride and identity. And you roll forward 30 years, South Africa won its 4th Rugby World Cup. And what was so unique about it is that the country was captained by a black captain for the first time. And what that does and what that says to so many people in our country about how they can dream, how they can break down barriers, and ultimately how they can see themselves in a sport that they never thought was possible is really powerful. And for me, that's always been something that stood out about the power of sports to unite us, to create these kind of seminal moments, but also for us to find ways, I think, to broach a lot of the differences we see in our society right now.
Yeah, I mean, I want to get really into the impact topic, but I have to ask you a couple of questions. I mean, your grandfather is probably one of the most famous people in the history of the human race for being one of the most human people ever in the history of the human race. You sat in the lap of greatness. What stories do you have? Any stories with respect to either the Rugby World Cup or then the Football World Cup, which came to South Africa?
I mean, with the Rugby World Cup, I remember us, being at the house the day before the final, and we were ushered into cars and we went to go and meet the team, and the team didn't know we were coming. And, he said a very simple thing. He said, I came here because I didn't want to add pressure, but there's 39 million people that are hoping that you're going to win tomorrow. And he shook everyone's hand, and he said, I'm not going to wash my hand because I know you guys are going to be champions, and I don't want to get rid of that feeling that I have now. And, lo and behold, and we ended up winning that Rugby World Cup. But equally so, with every triumph, there are failures. And so South Africa tried desperately to bring the first Olympics to Africa in 2004 with the bid that Cape Town put forth. And we ended up losing to Athens. And then again in 2006, we were head-to-head with Germany. And as goes with bids, we were hopeful that we were going to win that bid because New Zealand had promised to vote for South Africa. But when the vote actually happened, for some reason the New Zealand representative abstained. And Germany ended up getting that World Cup. But what was interesting about that is it made FIFA change its rules. And so for the next bid, FIFA actually made that bid exclusive to Africa. And South Africa was able to get the 2010 World Cup. And it's amongst a lot of turmoil, and I think a lot of people feeling that maybe Africa wasn't ready. We were able to put on a very successful World Cup that I think really reshaped how people saw the African continent and ended up being the most profitable World Cup that FIFA had done up until that point.
It's interesting because people say sport and business don't mix. Business and pleasure don't mix. Sport and politics don't mix. I think they sort of do. You've had a pretty lively discussion and debate with Anita Albarese, who's running the most extraordinary course at Harvard now. And we talk about countries bidding for things like the Olympics. And a lot of the developing world is going through that process now. And the concept of sport washing. What's your view on that? Because impact is important beyond the commerce, and that's what we're here talking about. But what's your view on the whole sort of notion of sport washing? That was leveled at Qatar, for example. I'd love your sort of perspective on that.
Look, I mean, Anita has done a lot of research, and her view, and I respect it, was that Russia and Qatar were forms of sports washing. I tend to take a different perspective on that. That taking global events, whether it's Formula One, whether it's the FIFA World Cup or the Cricket World Cup, to new places. When you do that and you do it right, you create people that are intrinsic fans for life. And you grow the game globally, right? Which is not just good for that sport, but it's potentially good for all the branding partners, right? It's good for all the countries that participate. And there's something very powerful in that. And I think we've heard that a lot, or for a long time, even when it comes to women's sports, right? For a long time, people said there's not enough money, and they're not popular enough. We know that's not the case. I tend to find women's sports far exceeds men's sports, just in terms of excitement and the competitive nature of it. And I think we're now seeing that take form and shape, right? And the next decade is really going to be the decade of women's sports.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. The one thing Jasper didn't tell you is that we've just signed a deal with the Women's World Cup Rugby, which for me is very exciting. I was at the final of the Women's World Cup in New Zealand 4 years ago. It was a cliffhanger and probably one of the greatest sporting contests I'd ever seen. It didn't matter, men, women, it was a great event. And now we've signed a deal to promote the next Women's World Cup. That's very exciting for us. And I think there'll be more money going into that to develop from top to bottom. So speaking of top to bottom, so you see all these countries bidding for these events. The question is, what happens next? I'm not sure. Everyone talks about legacy, and legacy can have many different, or it can have a lot of texture. South Africa's hosted Cricket World Cup, Football World Cup, several Rugby World Cups. How do you assess legacy and impact?
I mean, I think when it comes to these types of events, it's got to be the growth that you actually see in those countries. And for me, I kind of had a litmus test. 2010, successful World Cup. 2018, we undertake a campaign to celebrate my grandfather's centenary called Mandela 100 with Global Citizen. And we announced it on his birthday in July 18th. And we had 14 million people from across the world sign up in the space of 48 hours. And what was unique was they were all vying to participate in an event that they couldn't buy a ticket for. They had to earn, right? And so they had to take actions. So we had just over, I think, 26 million actions that were taken, all going towards people advocating on behalf of the world's most vulnerable communities. And that mobilization was really unique. And then the week of hosting the event, the amount of people that came up to me in South Africa and said, this felt like the 2010 World Cup, or this was bigger than that. And the fact that we could host a global event of that scale, of that spectacle, is the legacy of us being able to engage and be seen to cater for these types of events. And that's such a unique thing.
Yeah, I think sometimes, I hear a lot about, okay, we hosted the World Cup, but the team's not winning or whatever, and I think impact can come in many forms, and one of those is just the ability for it to permeate down to participation, to get more kids to move, especially at a time where we're probably more sedentary than we've been in the history of the human race, which is impacting life and lifestyle. So I think, we need to assess impact both quantitatively and qualitatively, and I think, just the ability to serve those who are underprivileged. Like you said, Global Citizens' mission, is to eradicate poverty, and they're leveraging music first, but popular culture. Ours is to leverage sport and popular culture, to create a healthier, happier population and planet. And I think we sometimes have to, reassess how we evaluate success. Yeah. In terms of Global Citizen, how would you, it started 10, 12 years ago, how would you assess its success thus far, and what would you change going forward given the dynamic state of the world?
Again, the mobilization, I would definitely say, has been a huge success, but in terms of our core goal when we started, which was the idea that we could end extreme poverty by 2030, we know now that's not realistic. Between COVID popping up, between new conflicts being born around the world, our target of moving over 1 billion people off living with $1.25 or less a day is not something we're going to hit by that target. It hasn't stopped us because we also know just prior to 2020, we saw extreme poverty halved. And so it can be defeated, right? And my grandfather said something in 2005. He said, poverty is man-made, and thus it will take the efforts of a great generation of humans to end it. But we know that's possible.
Yeah, I sometimes, we live in a really strange world where, the richest 127 people have more money than the poorest 5 billion, and we celebrate that. I also sometimes worry about the numbers, because the definition of what's poverty changes, and that affects the numbers, as opposed to actual real movement. How do the people in this room, we're all involved in sports, entertainment, it's powerful. Everyone's a fan of something. Everyone talks about fan engagement and engaging the fan. And how do we engage the fan through the things they love? Cricket, football, tennis, golf, music, fashion. How do we engage them more? And how do we get the people with the money to use this power for it to permeate down to the things that we're trying to deal with? Because to me, there's not enough happening.
Look, I think there's more and more, and again, we talk about the advent and the growth of women's sports and how big that will be. I think also encouraging people to start looking at going to places they've never been before. There's always been this theory that we need the perfect infrastructure, right? Or we need the perfect deals in place to take certain sporting events and entities places. And I don't necessarily think that's the case. When we think about our own entry into the things we love, usually there's a pretty low barrier, right? But what can exponentially grow from that is huge. And when you think about the global south and the fact that basically 3/4 of the world's population will come from that in the next 10 years, right? It's a perfect opportunity to engage with it. And I think what you're doing, Ravi, with Stepathlon is a unique thing that shows, right? You can have a commercialized property, but also have a huge impact.
Yeah, I think you talk about perfection. I think there's a great line about perfection being a prison and excellence being elastic. And I think there's no perfect deal, there's no perfect moment. But I think getting organisations to look at things both, said quantitatively and qualitatively, I think has got to be the role of rights holders, brands, custodians, etc. And I think that, and everyone can win, but I think it has to work top down and bottom up. And you talk about women's sport, I think there's a huge opportunity. I've always found it, especially now with all the direct-to-consumer channels, I've always found it strange that rights holders don't develop consumer brands. I think that's a huge opportunity for women's sport. You see the amount of money that went into buying the women's IPL teams is extraordinary. And the expansion teams will go for a lot of money. And I think the opportunity there is to develop consumer brands off the back of this IP, make heroes out of the players. And this could be anything from, hygiene to beauty to whatever. And I think that's something that men's sport has missed. They've let the Nikes and all these brands build businesses off the back of the IP of the rights holders. I think rights holders can do that, and then they can then permeate that down to participation and impact, and putting rackets in hands of kids that wouldn't have them, or golf clubs in hands of kids that wouldn't have them. And I think that's how you expand the base. So I think for women's sport, that's a huge opportunity. I know there are several organisations in here that are focused on women's sport, and I think go beyond the sponsorship and the media rights and the typical 4 or 5 revenue streams to creating ones with long tails, and those long tails could have serious influence, especially in the markets that we're talking about. Sure. Africa is, the median age of Africa is I think 17. It's 41 in Europe. India, the 55% of the population under the age of 25. These are young countries, and I think there's a real opportunity to have impact and take the lessons from the West, maybe learn from those and apply them to the greater context in the growth markets. And it's those growth markets that have the issues.
I agree. Look, I explained to the big live events companies when it comes to Africa, there's 700 million young kids on the continent, right? And imagine you can get $1 a year from them. And then in your second year, you can double that, right? That's 1.4 billion, right? The year after that, you can double it, right? It's 2.8 billion. And would you rather not have that, right, than have nothing, right? So it's just expanding people's minds to think about the opportunity.
So I think, these, I want to say, poor populous countries offer huge opportunity commercially and otherwise, and they need leadership, and I think this is the other thing. I think it's incumbent upon us and other people that have sort of been there and done that to provide leadership for the groups of people we just spoke to. We just spoke to a bunch of students, Kweku and I, wide-eyed, enthusiastic, teenagers, and I think there's an opportunity there. I think providing leadership to the next generation is the way to create the sort of impact that we're talking about. And to what extent is that happening in Africa? To what extent is Global Citizen looking at doing that sort of stuff, empowering the next generation to make a difference?
Look, I think mobilizing kids again to realize what their actions can do is a big part of that. The other thing is changing, I don't want to call them gatekeepers, but whether it's agents, managers, and the talent's mind. And so, we embarked on an initiative with Kendrick Lamar last year called Move Africa. And earlier this year, we met 45 of the biggest managers to talk about the fact that, people have world tours and yet they leave Africa off the map, right? And what was something that was really profound for me was the overwhelming sense that they wanted to change that, right? The managers themselves, the artists themselves wanted to change that. They wanted to create more recognition. So having those dialogues, having those conversations are so important, as you know, Rav.
But you make a very good point about India. India was the same, left off. It's starting to happen now, and prohibitive tax regimes and all that sort of stuff. So you need lobbying and all that to deal with those sort of environmental or administrative issues. But the reality of any form of popular culture is 95+% never ever get to the venue. Most Wimbledon fans will never get to Wimbledon. Most Olympic fans will never get to the Olympics. That's just the reality, and I think this is, again, so many people talk about fan engagement and fan activation, but I really feel like in practice, you get 4 or 5 kilometers away from a stadium and it's like it never happened. So using digital, more effectively. Awareness without action is a waste of time. So what is the action you're trying to create with more direct-to-consumer sales, more CSR, more impact? I think we have to define that and then use it digital efficiently and effectively. And this is where the poor populous countries offer opportunity. But as I said to the guys at Wimbledon, you don't expect to sell a lot of Ralph Lauren shirts in India, but you might get Indians to pay $1 a month for content, and there are a hell of a lot of Indians, right? So there are volume markets, there are margin markets. Customizing is the whole point of digital, right? Not treating a fan base as homogenous, but saying the 18-year-old African boy is different to the 56-year-old half Australian, half Indian male. You know what I mean? So, and I think creating digital cohorts, storytelling appropriately, right? Language is important, tone of voice is important. Digital offers that opportunity, and I really think that everyone's talking about digital and data, but we're still using it like analogs. And that leads me to the last point, which I want you to talk about, is we're at this incredible inflection point between analogs and digitals. The analogs are still writing checks about a world they won't live in. It's my 22-year-old daughter that will decide the future of Test cricket, not a bunch of 60-year-old gin-swilling guys at Lord's talking about the good old days. So how do you deal with that at this inflection point? Because to me, that's a struggle. I always say you should glance at the past and glare at the future, but I think a lot of decision makers are glaring at the past and giving lip service to the future.
I think everyone's scrambling to figure out kind of how they adapt and evolve, right? We heard about the confluence of sports franchises like the NBA or NFL, right, now bringing in entertainers from across the world to help them expose people to their brands. I think there are a number of so-called analogs, right, who are embracing that next generation, who surround themselves with young minds, who are very open to trying new things. And then I think the ability for us to embrace cultures in different ways, right? The emergence of things like K-pop, the emergence of Afrobeats, right, which is the #1 streaming genre in the world at the moment. They all point to this notion for us to invest in change. And I think we're starting to find that as leaders come through.
Yeah. Speaking of K-pop, I thought it was fascinating that there's an Australian girl from from Newcastle now going to Korea to do K-pop in English. I mean, if that's not unreal, I don't know what is. Olivia Marsh, apparently. So I'd keep an eye out for her as an Aussie. I love promoting Aussies. I wanted to ask you, everyone talks about content being king, you know, and again, for me, I don't think that's exactly true. I think cut-through is king, which is why the power of popular culture to deliver messaging is important. Getting a message from your favorite athlete as opposed to your doctor on health may make you eat less sugar, you know, or make you walk more or whatever. So for us, it's harnessing the power of popular culture to cut through. There is content everywhere. It's like white noise, like wallpaper. Global Citizen has access to so many big names, the biggest names on the planet. How have you done that well, and how have you not done that well?
I think, you know, we've always tried to create a bridge between what is pop culture, but also identifying local talent. A great example was in 2018, Eddie Vedder, the lead singer of Pearl Jam, came to South Africa, and initially he was going to come with the full band, but he decided he wanted to do something different. He wanted to work with the local choir, and so they worked on a 45-minute set, and it was the highlight of the show that we did in Johannesburg. This, you know, kind of heavy 90s rocker together with, you know, a gospel choir, and something harmonic came out of that, and that's content, right, you'll never see again. I also think we were able to adapt during COVID. You know, we did, I think, 4 of the biggest digital broadcasts with people all doing performances at home. And so being adaptable like that was something that we've done well. We've also, you know, I think at times had failures where unfortunately we've tried to follow trends. And I think one of the things we're realizing is bigger is not always better. Sometimes smaller, more intimate can be just as meaningful.
It's F1 week here. I know that your sports minister is pretty keen that F1 get back to South Africa. Tell me, F1's gone to a few countries and gone and left India, you know, South Africa, a few others. Tell me what, you know, how important is it for South Africa to get the F1 back there?
Look, I think it's a different chapter of South Africa. The last race was in 1993, right? Just before apartheid ended. We've had 30 years of democracy. We have a massive motor culture in South Africa. And we also have a track that with pretty little time we could turn around to be world class. And so I think there's a real impetus to bring it back, to showcase that Africa can host a Formula One and can bring its own unique spirit and twist to it. And so I know there's been a lot of advocating. Part of me being here this week is to do that. You know, and I think it's a great way to welcome people to come and experience the continent.
Okay, so we're sort of getting to the end of time. I just want to talk about, you know, you are a Mandela. You have probably the most recognizable surname on the planet. You know, how do you balance your personal ambitions with your business ambitions with expectations? You know, must sometimes be challenging personally and professionally, but also it's kind of a privilege, you know?
You know, again, I think try always be human. My grandfather had this thing that he would do when he was president, which was the idea of not getting trapped in the bubble, right? Because often when you're a politician, you're surrounded by bodyguards, you move from, you know, one location to the other. And he would always do this thing where he'd I think his first trip to the States, he was in Detroit, and they had a group of people there that were looking after him. And he said, what do they do in Detroit? And they said, well, we make automotive vehicles. And he's like, oh, really? Where do you do that? And we have a bunch of plants around here. He's like, I'd love to go and see one. And they're like, what? And he literally had them take him to the Ford plant. And he went and basically met everyone that worked at that Ford plant. And it was his way of staying in touch with people, right? Not becoming disconnected. And I think for me, that's always been a really important thing. So when I arrived this morning, one of the young students came up, but she literally stood next to me for 10 minutes and didn't say anything. And then she turned to me, she said, Mr. Mandela? And I was like, hi. She was like, I'd love to know if I could get a selfie. And usually I'd be like, no, but I was like, this was kind of so charming. I asked her name, and, I took a photo with her. And I think it's just having those human connections, which are always so vital and important.
Yeah, I've seen you over the course of the last 2 days sort of just walk up to people and have a chat. And if you watch the movie, which I think you all should do the next couple of days, it's a noticeable thing that, your grandfather made himself accessible, much to the stress of his security detail. And I think that was, to take that, and it really was a leap after being sequestered for so long, was a leadership, a sort of leadership that I don't think most people on the planet in history have ever been capable of. It's sort of so moving, and it's great that you're sort of carrying that legacy on. I don't know, Jas, are we doing questions or not? I think no questions. Oh well, then I think we're done. Mate, thanks very much. It's he really made a great effort to be here, flew all the way from South Africa to be here, and I think many people appreciate your efforts. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rob.